sorry, I'm just Shannon Murphy Robinson and Mary Casey, who are in the United States. And to give you a little idea of their profile, they are both co-founder of Brain Skill at Work, a consultancy that applies the latest neuroscience to inclusion, intercultural management, and leadership effectiveness. They work with Fortune 100, for-profit and non-profit organizations, and have successfully implemented inclusion initiatives and large-scale training rollouts. They achieved advanced certification as neuro-business coaches at Harvard in 2012 with Dr. Srini Pillai. They are co-author of the Brain State Management Self-Assessment Profile, the Neuroscience of Inclusion, Management and Conscious Bite white paper, and they just released book whose name is The Neuroscience of Inclusion, New Skills for New Times. So now I think it's time me to pass the microphone, if I can say it, to our two panelists. And please, Shannon and Mary, that's your turn. Go ahead.
Thank you, Pascal, and welcome everyone. This is Shannon Murphy Robinson, and then my colleague Mary is with me, and you'll hear from her in a moment. And we want to thank you for joining us. The topic that we're going to be looking at is self-awareness a skill that can be developed? And is the sound okay? Is everyone able to hear? Is the volume good? Checking in on that. Okay. If at any point you need us to speak louder, or because we get excited, and I personally can start to speak quickly when I get excited, to have us slow down, please put something in the chat right away, and Pascal will let us know that we either need to slow down or speak louder so that you're able to hear everything. We're going to be looking at, from a neuroscience and also practical perspective, is self-awareness a skill that can be developed? Because the short answer is yes. And this is where neuroscience really brings a lot that's helpful for us in terms of how we can increase self-awareness. We'll also be looking at a case study that involves 46 leaders who took the Brain States Management Self-Assessment tool, and we'll talk about the positive impact that it had for them and their team. But before we get into the data and into the tool, because the tool, the self-assessment is really a tool for gaining insight into one's overall self-awareness tendencies and ways to keep it online more consistently. And before we get into the case study, we want to spend a few minutes understanding some key facts about the brain and self-awareness, which is critical, of course, for cultural agility. It's critical for us to be inclusive in our behaviors. It's critical for leaders to lead effectively across differences. So what we're going to look at is, in terms of self-awareness, we have a question for you. How important do you think self-awareness is? We've got a poll. If you can go ahead and launch the poll. On a scale of 1 to 10, how important do you think self-awareness is for cultural agility and inclusion? With 1 being low and 10 being high. So take a moment, and how important is self-awareness to cultural agility and inclusion? 1 is low, 10 is high. So we'll give you a moment to respond to the poll. In another moment, the poll will be closed and we'll see the results.
So far we have 45 out of 56. I suppose some have response through the chat, but please try to respond to, you know, the polls. Well, it seems that we, 47. We have 83% of response, Mary and Shannon. Do we end the polls?
Sure.
Okay.
Yes. Go
yeah,
ahead
well,
and
this
close.
come to one just to have an idea. Ups, and the poll and share results. Here it is. Do you see it?
Yeah, so we've got 2% giving it a 7, 15% giving it an 8, 17% giving it a 9, and 67% giving it a 10. So overall, these poll results would reflect that, yes, you think self-awareness is really important to cultural agility and being inclusive. What we'd like to do is let's close the poll, and
Yes.
now in your chat, if you can put a couple words about why you think it's so important. So type in a couple of words. Yeah. So of why you think it's important or not. So if you don't see it as being important, why? So take a moment and use your chat function for that to type in a couple words about why. I'm really nervous. This isn't the right deck. I know. When I reloaded, I wonder if I clicked. I know I double checked it the first time. Take just one more moment. And Pascal, is there a way then that those chats, that everyone can see that, what people typed in?
So, sorry, do you see the chat yourself, Shannon and Mary?
No, it's not displaying.
Okay. So everybody is responding that if you want to understand others, you first to understand yourself. Basically, that's the message for all of them. But I would like to share this with you. I can save the chat, allow others. Let's see your panels and attendee. Allow attendee to chat. No?
Otherwise, Pascal, if you want to just read some
Yes,
of the responses.
Yes, sure.
That will be fine.
Sure. Let me take to the first one. Impossible to know others if you don't know yourself. If you are not aware of yourself, you cannot be aware of others. Being mindful of what you are sending. You know your own expectation and cultural lenses. Hard to understand others if you don't understand yourself. Precondition for understanding others. Know yourself first to understand and respect differences. Figure ground, yes, important. I don't know. Only when you are self-aware can you understand what you bring to the table and how you impact on given situation. Now you know yourself to learn others. If you don't know where you are, you won't know where you're going, because it allows me to take better control of my action. Let me see what else we have. If you aren't aware of yourself, you cannot understand others. You need to know yourself in order to be able to understand others, to analyze your own style and others, and be able to adjust. Yes, it's a bit lost. You need to know how others may be perceiving you, because knowing yourself, your worldview, your preference is the first step to understand what is happening when you and others, I guess there's a verb missing, but are interacting, I guess. To understand how prejudiced we need to be aware of. Then somebody else say humility for the international diversity, open-mindedness for learning. One must know oneself and manage oneself to be able to know and manage others. Only in being aware of myself, I can also be aware of how others are. Others can only be perceived in relation to self. And I think we need to know ourselves well before we can begin making adjustment to others. If you are aware of yourself, it's easier. Yeah, that's basically what I get.
Okay. Thank you, Pascal. So some really key themes around understanding self and needing to do that before you can understand others, to help in terms of being open-minded, to be able to understand prejudice, and I'm assuming, assumptions, biases is part of that, in order to adjust our behaviors, which both for cultural agility and for inclusion is critical for us to be able to do that effectively. So here's the good news. So now that we know that self-awareness is important, clearly, and these are some really compelling reasons that you typed in. In fact, we'll often refer to self-awareness as a mega competency because it's such a foundational core skill that we need to develop. And the good news is that understanding now what's coming through from neuroscience, it can help us do this. And Mary's going to talk more about that.
Hello everyone, this is Mary. And as you can see, we've got a little magnifying glass on the brain. And many of you have probably had some exposure to this idea of, what we can now understand about the brain from the MRI and fMRI technology. And we can look at what's happening in real time as we perform tasks, make decisions, think thoughts, and feel emotions. All of that is now mappable, and we can look at it and learn from it. And this is our topic for today, is what do we know about the brain self-awareness and how it can be developed? And neuroscience is making it very clear that self-awareness is comprised of actual neural connections that can be identified, trained, and strengthened in the brain through practice. And that is actually phenomenal, to now be able to identify what part of the brain is involved in our ability to be self-aware. Because as Shannon was saying, self-awareness is the first step towards making a choice to do a certain behavior or not. We have to have that awareness to make the behavior choices that are in line with agility and inclusion across cultures. And so what we want to look at now is the other aspects of self-awareness that neuroscience is giving us some insight about and how we can develop it. So self-awareness is first available in the prefrontal cortex, which is located in the neocortex of the brain. This is interesting because the prefrontal cortex is not stable. It can actually go offline. And so that's an important point we'll come back to. Self-awareness is easily destabilized by negative thoughts, feelings, sometimes even the wrong kind of stress and pressure can just, if it's very, intense, we lose access to the prefrontal cortex and we lose access to self-reflection and self-awareness and the choice to make a new behavior. Actually, Self-awareness takes more brain energy throughout the day than other kinds of tasks. This is very well founded in the research. It's very established that when we make the decision to be conscious of our behavior, because the unconscious brain is extremely powerful, and it runs 50 to 60% of our decisions every day. We have to exert real energy to be conscious and to not be acting out of these unconscious patterns. And so it's really important in terms of being able to do something new. Self-awareness is impacted by brain states. This you will see more about as we talk about the brain states management self-assessment and the study that we did with the leaders. And you'll see how self-awareness is really tied into how we're choosing to manage ourselves using our brain states management. And self-awareness can be consciously developed. Now we know this because there's a lot of tools out there that give us psychological feedback that helps us gain more information about ourselves, which is one aspect of self-awareness. This aspect of self-awareness that we're talking about today are the skills that we can use to really target that area of the brain to be more conscious and more able to make the choice for inclusion and being effective across cultures. And so this is all good, except there's a central paradox that trips us all up all the time. And that is that just when we need self-awareness the most, it may be unavailable. And that happens because of the way that the brain evolved. And Shannon is going to talk a little bit about that now.
And when you look at how the brain developed over time, and I'm sure many of you have heard of the triune brain, sometimes referred to as the evolutionary brain, which really speaks to that the brain developed in 3 distinct regions over time. First being the reptilian brain, or the lower brain. A lot of that is the autonomic nervous system, fight, flight, that sort of thing. And then the next region to develop was the limbic region. And this now brings capacities for emotions, all emotions, for learning, for memory, those aspects that are all part of the limbic region. And then the neocortex, and particularly the prefrontal cortex, which is the newest part of the brain. And the prefrontal cortex in particular is really, really critical, because this is where the prefrontal cortex is that executive powerhouse of our thought and our reasoning. And when we think about developing high levels of self-awareness, one of the things that's often tricky is letting go of our conditioned ideas and beliefs, especially when we're working across cultures and differences. And that experience can leave the brain feeling unsure. We lose familiar patterns. The patterns that we had don't work, which we see all the time in working across cultures. And it's often referred to, and many of you have heard of it, as cognitive dissonance. And this is a really uncomfortable place for the brain. And in order to move forward with new behaviors and really maintain high levels of self-awareness, we have to have that prefrontal cortex engaged. So you'll see now as we move into brain states management, how these really come into play, because each of these main brain regions become what we call a brain state. So we've got the higher brain state, which corresponds to the prefrontal cortex, and a lot of those high executive functions that I was just touching on. The limbic brain state, which corresponds with the limbic region, and then the stress brain state, which corresponds with that lower or reptilian brain. Now, when we put this into the brain states management model, what we find is, for instance, perception is not static in the brain. So perception, which you see on the left-hand side of the model, ranges from being really open to really closed, meaning on the high end, When we're in the higher brain state, the brain is open to the widest range of perception, the most open field of possibilities, can see the big picture. When, as we go into different brain states, the limbic or the threat, that becomes, it drops and it becomes more closed, to where perception becomes very, very narrow. And I see very few options, very few possibilities. Thinking often evolves into more either or sort of things. And then choice, if you see that along the bottom, choice is also very dependent on what brain region is dominating in the moment. Now, our choices can range from being very unconscious and driven by the unconscious brain, or being very conscious and being much more intentional and purposeful in our choices. When we are making behavioral choices to adapt our behaviors, for instance, across cultures, across differences, that requires a lot of conscious choice. So you see, we have the most ability to do that when we're in the higher brain state. And then choice becomes more unconscious. And for instance, the threat stress brain state, this is often where we're in a more reactive mode. We may just react and our behaviors are just driven very unconsciously about it. And then the next piece that really comes into play with the brain states management model, the last axis here is self-awareness. Because just like perception and choice, self-awareness will dramatically fluctuate depending on what brain state is dominating in the moment. Now, we all move in and out of these brain states all day long. You know, we all fluctuate in and out of them. And let's say, think about, and I'm sure you've experienced each of these brain states yourselves, and you've probably seen them in other people as well. So think about for a moment, if we look at the higher brain for a moment, think about your best days, where your day is going really well, you have really open access to curiosity, to being open-minded, to really listening, to try to understand somebody else's perspective or view or where they may be coming from. You're able to direct your attention really well. It feels good. You know, we can be very, very effective when we're here. So think about some of those, your best moments, your best days. Chances are you are in that higher brain state. Now, let's just to put this into an example in real time, because we all fluctuate in and out. Now, let's say that you're at work, you're heading into a meeting for a critical project, and there's some deadlines coming up. There's a lot at stake with this project, and you walk into the meeting, and the first thing you find out is the budget's being cut for your portion of the project. And it's only your portion of the project that's being impacted. Chances are you're going to start to fluctuate into the other brain states and start to react to that news. You might work hard to try to stay in the higher brain, to really listen to what's being said, understand why this decision was made. And then let's say that there's another person in the meeting that, for whatever reason, perhaps you don't particularly like or don't have high regard for, and they make a critical comment about your section, a very negative, disparaging type of comment about your section of the project. Chances are you're going to go right into limbic or even threat stress in that moment and go right into react mode. And that's often when we're like, I can't believe they said that. Or we often may say things and do things and speak from that place of reaction that only later, when we've calmed down, we realize, and the higher brain states back online, that we realize, oh, I really got caught in a reaction and I did not handle that well. My best thinking was not online. That didn't go so well. And so we all fluctuate in and out of these. And what I'm going to show you is each of the brain states in just a little more detail to anchor each of these. Now, the higher brain state is where, as we saw, we can access the highest levels of self-awareness. What this also allows us to do is it makes us able to notice and challenge our biases, assumptions, our preferences. Someone mentioned, for instance, about understanding your prejudices. It's where we can stay open-minded, even under pressure and stress. And the higher brain state is where we can think about our thinking. And so it gives us a good ability to be able to monitor our thoughts and feelings in the moment. So we can notice, oh, the budget was cut. I am going into reaction about that. And it's where we can consciously choose behaviors of inclusion and create higher level outcomes across difference. And this is where conscious choice is most available. Now, in the limbic brain state, self-awareness is available, but the limbic brain state is a little tricky because self-awareness is less stable. And open-mindedness becomes limited by fluctuating awareness. Because this brain state, we can fluctuate more because it is less stable, it can also quickly get tipped toward more reactive thinking and more inconsistent ability to recognize and manage negative emotions that can further limit perception and further limit self-awareness. So with the limbic brain state, our choices, our ability to make conscious choice is more inconsistent than it is in the higher brain. And then with the threat stress response, with the threat stress brain state, when we're in that threat response state, self-awareness is at an all-time low. It's the paradox that Mary was talking about. Just when we need it the most, we literally cannot access it in the brain. We get more knee-jerk responses. It's characterized more by fight, flight, or freeze. And it's really difficult for the brain to make more positive choices or to even believe that more positive choices or outcomes exist. So conscious choice becomes the most unavailable. So question for you, and this is something for you to type into your chat, how have you seen, thinking about these different brain states, and especially the limbic or the threat stress brain state, how have you seen lower brain states impact self-awareness and the behaviors of cultural agility and inclusion? So it's really, how do those lower brain states impact the behaviors of being able to be culturally agile and inclusive? So go ahead and type just 2-3 words of what impact you've seen lower brain states impact on behaviors. So I'll give you just a moment to go ahead and type those in. And Pascal, once they have typed in, if you could pull out some of the themes for us of what people have typed in, but let's give them another moment to do that.
Yeah, sure.
So how have you seen lower brain states impact behavior for cultural agility and inclusion?
Okay, I think I can start it, and so I follow. First response is anger. Then second response, I react automatically. Third response, rejection of others. Fourth, I become very judgmental. Fifth, frustration. Less inclusion, less acceptance. Another person say frustration. Let me see. When in lower brain state, people are tuned inwards and seems to often block outside stimuli in reaction to stress, danger. Lower brain state equal racism, rejection, negative bias, unconscious bias. People retreat into defense mechanism and oversimplification, rejection of diversity, judging whole person's personality just by one behavior, sad, angry, aggressive. I become very judgmental even though I recognize it and I don't want to be judgmental. Lack of patience, stereotyping, lower brain state produce prejudice. You act unconscious and suddenly aggressive. Reaction and lack of analysis, poor situational analysis, anxiety, influence, tolerance. For expat, I think it's the moment when the first phase of the adaptation curve is starting to go down, the threat stress, feeling misunderstood, underestimated, has the tendency to act in a non-inclusive way, misunderstanding because of the inability to understand other behavior. We apparently cannot escape human nature despite aiming at highly sophisticated education and civilization. In case of stress and threat, automatic action are instinctive and not self-aware, angry, emotional, vegetative, basic instinct, aggressive, and that's it.
Mm-hmm. That's a lot of impact.
Yes.
That's a very robust list and a lot of impact. And Mary and I were both nodding our heads. You couldn't see that while Pascal was reading the list. Excellent responses and spot on. That's exactly what happens when we're in the lower brain states and we lose self-awareness. Our perception narrows and becomes very closed, and our choices become much more unconscious. Now here's the good news, is we can learn to work with the brain to keep self-awareness high and to lessen the impact of these lower brain reactions. And that's what we're going to look at next. And Mary's going to walk you through a case study we did with managers specifically to help them increase their ability to keep high levels of self-awareness.
And this case study we did with a team of, I believe we wound up with 46 people, and it was with a large medical clinic. And this was the senior leader and his direct reports. And they were interested in learning more about how come, as a very supportive group of inclusion people, they felt very strongly about having more diversity in their team and being more inclusive. They were really struggling with keeping that as a reality. They had it as a desire and they had it as a goal, but they weren't making any progress. And as we were talking with them, we thought it might be a nice opportunity for them to take our brain states management self-assessment. And that's a tool that we have. Now, we did mention that we all fluctuate through all these brain states all the time. Every day we go, hopefully we're not fluctuating as much on our best days, but things happen. And the more skilled we get with our ability to manage brain states, the less time we go to the lower and the greater time we spend in the higher. And that was one of the goals of the team that we were working with. And so our brain states management self-assessment is a tool that gives you some insight and some information about your brain state tendencies. And we all have certain tendencies to either keep ourselves in the higher brain more often under more extreme circumstances, or we have a tendency to not be able to manage that fence very well, and we slip more easily into a limbic or sometimes even threat or stress. So it's about consistency. How consistent are we in our ability to keep access to the higher brain? And that's what the assessment, the self-assessment, helps people just get a sense of. So the process was that 46 managers took the self-assessment, and then they received their self-awareness feedback report. And they did that prior to the session. So everybody had logged on and taken the assessment, got their results, and they brought the results to the training. And then in this debrief session, which was a half a day, the entire group data was presented, which we'll share with you in a moment. And then also in that session, individuals spent time identifying their strengths and also their areas for development, because the brain states management assessment gives feedback in 3 main performance areas: inclusion, communicating, and building trust. Communicating specifically to build trust as it relates to neuroscience, and decision making. And so it gives specific information about neuroscience and the brain states behaviors related to those 3 areas of performance. And so they spent some time doing individual and pairs work and working with their results. The outcome of that debrief session was they wanted to go further and do some skills development and to focus their energies around what they can actually now develop to target their ability to access and maintain a higher brain more often to improve in those performance areas. And I'll share that data with you now just so you can see how the group broke down. So the overall percentages of the brain states are reported here. So there were 43 respondents, the 43 people who actually took the assessment. And this higher brain, 9 people showed up in the higher brain in this score range, which is 21% of the group. In the limbic brain state, 34 of the 43 showed up, and that's 79% of the whole group. And then there was 0 that showed up as a tendency towards a threat stress, which is great. Now these percentages are very typical. We don't often see anything more than 20% in the higher brain, and this is actually a little bit higher than we see. Often we can see 10%, 12%. And then as you break these down into a little bit more detail within each brain state, in the higher brain, we break it down for the individuals in the report to see the high end of the higher brain range and then the lower end, which we call high awareness and good awareness. And so the people who were in the very high end, there were 2 of them, which is 22% of that group. And in the very good awareness, there were 7 individuals, which again, the lower end of the higher range is more typical of the groups that we work with. And then the final breakdown in the limbic region is moderate to low awareness. 33 individuals in moderate awareness, which is 97% of that number. And then low awareness, there was 1 person. And again, these are very typical. I would say in general, this was actually a little bit higher ratings and again, these are self assessments. So people are just looking at their own, they're taking the assessment online, and there's a series of questions, and we'll be getting into what those questions are and how they relate to learning to manage brain states in just a moment. But just to share with you that this data then was very compelling to the group, and what they wanted to be able to do was have more competency in recognizing when they weren't in the higher brain, and skills in being able to get themselves back there if they weren't. And so we went forward then with a 1-day training. And what we're going to share with you now, or what Shannon's going to share with you now, are just the highlights of some of the things we did in the 1 day, some of our key approaches for the competency and skills development.
So for the skills development, there were really two overall core pieces, because they did want to be able to increase their ability to manage brain states. And so we focused on the brain states management, and then they also wanted to be able to improve their in-the-moment communication skills as well. So we focused on the brain states management piece. Really, in terms of brain states management, there's three primary skills that we teach. The first is around recognizing the examples that you typed into the impact. We can move in these and happen so quickly and so unconsciously that sometimes we don't even realize the higher brain has gone offline, because that prefrontal cortex can become destabilized so quickly and often outside of our awareness. So it becomes really important as the first fundamental skill to help people recognize and be able to learn tools to be able to do that, to recognize your brain state in the moment. Then, once we know where we're at, then we'd work with them and taught them different strategies and tools to be able to shift. So once they realize, okay, the higher brain's no longer online, how do I get back there? And so then we worked with them around some tools and strategies for that, with really then the overall goal being to maintain higher brain state more of the time. No one necessarily will be here 100% of the time, yet we can absolutely increase our ability to be here more and more of the time. And here's the good thing from a brain perspective: as we practice these skills, we're actually building and strengthening the neural pathways in the brain that make this easier and easier to do in the moment. Sometimes we refer to it as self-directed neuroplasticity, where we can actually intervene in a very conscious way in being able to recognize and shift our brain states so that we can keep that access to the higher brain. For the leaders, that was really critical, because with their organization, they needed those leaders to be able to be inclusive and to be culturally agile and to really lead effectively across differences. And we saw from your responses, when those lower brain states are online, we lose our capacity to do that. And not only do we lose our capacity to do that, we're actually more likely to act on our unconscious biases and assumptions and our preferences and not even know it. One of the things they discovered going through this process was that they had a lot of unconscious preferences around similarities. They hired from the same organizations, they hired from the same education backgrounds, they hired people that were more like them and in a place of comfort, for instance. So they realized we really need to be able to move the brain from that place of comfort to a place of discomfort to do something different. And we have to have the higher brain online to do that, and to make conscious choices, to go out of pattern and to do things differently, so that we can be more culturally agile and we can be more inclusive. What we did then, the last two things I just want to highlight briefly so that then we save some time for question and answer, is we then looked at and did some work with, this is part of the brain states management, there's 7 dimensions that are all based on neuroscience that are what the assessment looks at. So there's sets of questions under each one of these dimensions that then roll up into the brain state. Well, which were the dimensions overall. And we find actually across groups that brain energy and attention and positivity tend to be the lowest across groups. And then they were able to do some work and really understand how these dimensions can be strengthened, to personally for themselves to increase their levels of self-awareness and then work more effectively with their teams. The second piece, so that was all part of the brain states management skill development that we did with them. The other big area of skill development we did with them during the day was they wanted to be able to then apply. And so once we can manage brain states in the moment, how can we really then communicate more effectively across differences? And so we worked with them with our SAVE communication model, which is built on the neuroscience of appreciation. And the entire model and process is designed to keep the higher brain online and try to, I guess if you will, save the communication from the defensive brain. Because when any of those lower brain states get triggered, the brain immediately goes into defensive mode, as we saw, in fact, with some of your responses. And so this whole process and model is designed to really keep the higher brain online and keep appreciation and curiosity and open-mindedness online. And so it's a process model that we taught them and worked with on them. And you can see the few steps there. We won't take time to go into this now, but wanted to just give you a high-level overview of the two main areas of skill development that we did with them. And what they found after was they said they became much more aware. They became more aware of their brain states in the moment. In fact, they even laughed and said there's times when they were going to tell a colleague something, and they'd say, now I know this might send you into a limbic or threat brain state, but just hear me out. And so it gave them a common language and common platform that they could really then work from. And especially when they were then communicating in difficult conversations across differences, they said it kept it easier for them to have those difficult conversations in a way that was positive, that was productive, and where people left the conversation feeling heard and affirmed. And that's often a challenge when having those difficult conversations across differences. So those were some of the key aspects of what we did. We're going to wrap up the case study now, and then, oh, I guess we can, I'll just put that one back up, and we'll open it up for questions. And also, I guess if you do want more detail on the models and some of those, a lot of this is in the book that was just released as well. But let's open it up for questions and answers. You know, so any questions that you've had, Pascal, do you want them to type them in?
Yes. Shall I type? It's amazing that you don't see. I see if I can. But I can only type in the chat unless I just tell you. I don't see any other option where I could type myself, but let's get back. I get question about what are the exercises that raise the level? How does the shifting of the brain states happen in the training? How are these skills reinforced over time to embed the behavior change identified? I contend that top sports people operate in the higher brain states, and with a comment, asking for a comment. What do you do with negative stressing participant in the team? You are caring, but the other person is negative. That's what I have.
Okay. Could you repeat the first one or two? I'm not sure if we caught all of them. So
okay.
What was the first question again, Pascal?
Yeah. The first question is, what are the exercises that raise the level?
Mm-hmm.
And the second question is, how does the shifting of brain states happen in the training? And another question, so now I get more question. How can you be aware of the threat, stress state of the need to change brain states?
Okay, let's start there because that's such a primary question and it's so fundamental to how we approach training the process for developing these brain state skills. The first thing is that recognize, and that's what that question really addresses, is how do we learn to pay attention to what's even happening that's causing that we can know what brain state we're in. And our first is recognizing, when we talked about the recognizing part of brain skills, that's the first step. Recognize a lot of work that we do is around the physiology and the physical cues that we have to learn to pay attention to. And once we really put the energy into training ourselves to pay attention to those cues, and the cues are typically things like increased heart rate, you know, the voice gets stronger or it gets lower, and we might be feeling it in our guts. Whatever those little triggers are for us, we have to learn to personally recognize them and train ourselves to know that they are fundamental to what's going to happen next. And that's then the first clue. Okay, so I'm feeling myself going into a lower limbic state here. And so then we have the process of how do you then, once you've recognized it, begin, what are the next things to do to begin to shift? And that's when we move into the next one, into shifting.
Yeah. And sometimes even just getting that awareness that the higher brain's gone offline is enough for people to shift in the moment, and they can simply shift. Other times it's not so easy. Sometimes we can get stuck, or we can be in such a strong reaction that we need some tools and strategies. And so we teach people tools, and a lot of these are in the book, tools to use in the moment and tools to use later. So if you find you're stuck, you can't shift in the moment, some tools that you can go back later and look at, okay, what kept me stuck? Why couldn't I make a shift in the moment? So there's a lot of those tools and strategies specifically mapped out right in the book as well. And yeah, I would agree. I do think it would be interesting. We haven't seen any studies about it, but I do suspect that a lot of top sports people would be very much in the higher brain, and a lot of awareness in terms of their physiology and their overall state, because those have huge impact on performance. I'm sure it'd be interesting to see some studies around that. I know we've got just a few minutes left. One thing we do also want to offer, as members of SIETAR Europa and those of you that are on this call, if you're interested in taking the brain states management self-assessment, let us know and we'll send you a 30% off coupon to take it. It's in the process of being updated right now, but within a short while we'll have the updates done and then it will be ready. So if you want to email us, you can simply email info@brainskillsatwork.com. So info@ and then BRAINSKILLSATWORK.com, and we'll send you a coupon code for a 30% SIETAR special discount on the self-assessment, and we'll let you know once it's available. It's very low cost. Normally it's $24.99, but US dollars, but then you'd get 30% off of that. So that's something we want to extend to you as a SIETAR piece. Any other last comments? We'll turn it back to you, Pascal.
Yes. Let's see, there are several. Does mindfulness training increase the ability to upper the brain states? Another one, how is it that all possible to shift as quickly as the situation requires? And if so, how? We hear count to 10, do a difficult math problem in your mind. Is it how one would try to do it?
Yes, mindfulness training does help. Where mindfulness training helps, and there's some studies around this, is in terms of increasing the skill of metacognition, which is one of the 7 dimensions underlying brain states management. And metacognition is really important for keeping self-awareness high and also for crossing cultures effectively. There's some interesting studies around that where if you have cultural knowledge, but you don't have also strong metacognition, you're more likely to revert back to stereotypes and assumptions and biases. Whereas if individuals have strong metacognition and coupled with the cultural knowledge, they're much, much more effective in the ability to be culturally effective. And metacognition is only one of the 7 different skills that all roll up into the brain states management. And each of those dimensions are interrelated. So as one gets strengthened, it positively impacts others. But they're all interconnected.
Thank you very much, Shannon and Mary. So thank you very much for the extremely interesting presentation. I would like also to announce our next webinar to all of the participants. That will be taking place on the 12th of October, and the title is Hidden Logics, New Templates for Intercultural Understanding. So just keep a look on your email and just feel free to register. Anyway, that will be then the end of our webinar. So thank you, everyone, and hope to see you next time. Thank you very much, Mary and Shannon. It was extremely interesting.
Thank you, everyone, for attending. And thank you, Pascal.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.